What would Martin Luther King say if he were seeing this with his own eyes? You need to feel it, not just understand it. Because this isn't theory, this is a living wound. And when the pain comes from someone on your side, when the wall isn't just raised by the enemy, but by hands that look like yours, the blow carries a different weight. Zendaya knows what that's like. And maybe you do too. She walks into an audition ready, with talent, with presence. But she leaves with a sentence that turns into a knife. You're not the right type of black. She hears this more than once, from more than one mouth, and not from outsiders, but from people who are supposed to understand. And Martin Luther King would say that this type of violence, disguised as an aesthetic choice, is a poison that we've learned to swallow with a smile. But it corrodes, slowly, from the inside. Have you ever noticed how silence sometimes screams louder than the offense itself? Zendaya grew up in that silence, the silence of absence, of not being chosen, of almost made it. Because being too light or too dark to be accepted within the same pain that shaped you is a condemnation that you don't read in the headlines. But you feel it on your skin. You carry it on your shoulders. And nobody talks about it honestly. Martin Luther King would ask you why you still measure blackness by the scale of melanin. He would point his finger at you, without disrespect but with urgency, and say that as long as we continue to divide our bodies into categories, the oppressor doesn't even need to get their hands dirty. The structure keeps working on its own. And then, at the Oscars, when Zendaya appears with her dreadlocks, it's not vanity, it's defiance. It's not an accessory, it's ancestry. And what do? They laugh. They insinuate dirtiness, drugs, sloppiness. And they do it on the stage of glamour, of beauty, of celebration, as if black beauty can only exist if it's tamed, straightened, edited. Martin Luther King wouldn't lower his eyes there. He would stand up with his whole body. He would say that there's no true freedom when the symbol of your pride needs to be justified, explained, defended. He would say that the strands of hair that Zendaya wore on that carpet were strands of memory, and that by laughing at that, they're mocking much more than a hairstyle, they're mocking dignity, the root. But you might think that's all in the past, that it was just an unfortunate comment. Zendaya didn't think so, because when she responded, it wasn't to attack, it was to educate. And Martin Luther King would see in that something that few perceive. She held back the pain to transform it into speech. And that takes more courage than fighting back. It requires clarity of purpose. Clarity that only those who understand the cause beyond their own navel can have. And later, when she sits down to negotiate a role with Disney, she does something that many wouldn't. She doesn't accept just any offer. She demands. She doesn't want to be just another caricature. She doesn't want to repeat the comfortable stereotype. And that's not a whim. It's strategy. It's resistance disguised as a contractual clause. Martin Luther King would see there a seed of change, a disruption, because whoever dictates the rules shapes the imagination, and Zendaya knew that. Have you ever stopped to think about what it means for a black actress to demand that her character have a well-structured black family, without drama, without trauma, without scandal? Do you know how much that bothers people? Because it breaks an expectation. Because it doesn't give the addiction to suffering a stage as an identity. Because it proposes a narrative where being black isn't synonymous with pain, but with power. And she could stop there, but she didn't. Zendaya looks around and says in no uncertain terms, "I know my privilege." Not as an excuse, but as a warning. She knows that her light skin protects her from some invisible bullets, and she doesn't deny it. She owns it. She exposes it. She uses it, and that bothers people even more. Martin Luther King would call that expanded racial consciousness. It's when you understand that your individual victory isn't the victory of the community. It's when you recognize that opening doors is just the beginning. The real challenge is keeping those doors open even after you've passed through them. And at this point, Dr. King would look at you deeply, not with anger, with pain. The pain of someone who dreamed of a future where black girls would be measured by their character, not by their skin tone. The pain of someone who still sees the world testing the dignity of those who dare to be free. You need to understand, Zendaya isn't an exception. She's just one of the few who managed to put a spotlight on what many prefer to hide. She didn't play the martyr. She didn't apologize for existing. She didn't remain silent in the face of mockery. but she also didn't shout for revenge. She spoke firmly, and that sometimes bothers people more than a scream. Martin Luther King would have no doubts. He would say that she's not just an actress, she's proof. Proof that it's possible to walk through fire without turning to ash. Proof that there are still voices that know that the fight is bigger than the audience. And you, where do you stand in this? Have you ever stopped to ask yourself if you're not helping to maintain the cycle? If you've ever judged a black woman by her hair, by the way she speaks, by her skin tone? Have you ever realized that sometimes racism doesn't scream, it whispers, it suggests, it excludes slowly? Dr. King would say that the greatest danger isn't declared hatred, but indifference disguised as neutrality. And as long as there are black people being measured by standards that weren't made by them, the fight continues. It doesn't matter if the stage is an audition or the red carpet. And if you think this is an exaggeration, it's because maybe you've never had to prove who you are before even showing what you can do. Zendaya has, many others have, every day. And Dr. King, if he were here now, would repeat something that you've already heard, but maybe never really listened to. You can't walk with your eyes closed and expect to find justice on the way. Open your eyes, look again, listen. Because Zendaya's story isn't an isolated case. It's just another part of a book that's still being written with black ink, black blood, and pages stained with silence. And you still have the nerve to say that racism is over? And yet you try to call this progress. You call it inclusion when they put a single black actress in the center of the scene, but maintain all the criteria of beauty, of behavior, of narrative, shaped by a gaze that was never ours. And then you see Zendaya, and you think that her presence solves something. It doesn't solve anything. It exposes what many pretend not to see. It exposes how much we're still negotiating our humanity. Martin Luther King wouldn't accept this as progress, because he knew that partial justice is injustice disguised. And what we see today, so often, is a showcase of diversity with the same owners of the store. Zendaya isn't an enlightened exception. She's the reflection of a structure that only allows the presence of black people when they fit in. And when she doesn't fit in, when she dares to be whole, when she refuses to be the ornament of inclusion, the response comes quickly. Rejection, joke, judgment. Do you know how many times this has happened before Zendaya? How many black artists gave up because they were forcibly sculpted to fit a role that was never made for them? How many had to change their voice, their hair, their name? And how many have you seen disappear without ever knowing why? Because it's not enough to have talent. You need to bend, to soften, to polish yourself until you don't bother anyone, until you don't scare anyone. Dr. King would say that the world isn't afraid of mediocre black people. The fear is of the lucid black person, of the black person who thinks, who demands, who confronts without losing composure. And Zendaya is that. She doesn't scream. She doesn't impose herself with violence. But the simple fact of being there, being who she is, bothers people. Because the dignity of a black woman is still treated as an exception. And exceptions don't change the system. They only serve to fuel the illusion that everything is fine. Have you ever seen how they treat a black woman's hair when she appears with braids, with dreads, with natural texture? Zendaya was called dirty on national television. And what hurts the most is knowing that many who saw that weren't shocked. Because they were already used to that kind of violence. Racism has become sophisticated. It no longer needs handcuffs. It comes in the form of opinion, of comment, of humor. And when you react, they still say it's an exaggeration. Martin Luther King faced this his whole life. And he would say to you now, with all the strength that still echoes in his speeches, that racism doesn't end when the insults stop. It ends when the structures that support this thinking are demolished. And do you really think they have been? Do you think that because a black woman appears on the cover of a magazine, the wound has healed? Dr. King would see Zendaya as a reminder that the fight has changed its setting, but not its essence. What was once a closed door is now a guarded entrance. You enter, but you need to follow the rules. You need to smile right, dress right, speak right. You need to be grateful for being there, even when it's clear that your presence is still tolerated, not celebrated. And when Zendaya demands respect, she bothers people more than if she had broken everything, because she says with every choice she makes that her dignity isn't for sale. that it's not enough to give a role, it's necessary to change the script. And that, for those who are used to controlling the narrative, is a threat. Have you ever realized that the problem is never what the black person does, but the space they occupy? The problem is them wanting to be the protagonist. It's them wanting to be heard without a filter. It's them wanting their image not to be distorted, softened, adapted. Zendaya didn't just want a role. She wanted a reflection. She wanted black girls to see themselves whole, without having to hate themselves first. Martin Luther King would tell you that real freedom isn't being present. It's being whole. It's not needing to ask permission to exist. It's not having to thank you for every crumb. And do you still think that's what we have today? Do you still think it's enough to be in the picture? Zendaya went further. She looked at the mirror of the industry and said, "I'm not going to break myself to fit in." And that's why she was attacked. Not with stones, but with words. And Dr. King would remind you that there are words that hurt more than blows, because they don't leave marks on the body, but they build invisible prisons in the mind. How many times has a black girl heard that her hair isn't beautiful? That her skin is too dark? That her nose is wide? That her mouth is big? Zendaya carries these questions on her face. She carries the answers in her eyes. And yet she continues, not out of heroism, but because she knows that if she stops, everything comes back. And it doesn't just come back to her, it comes back to everyone. Martin Luther King never wanted to create martyrs. He wanted to create awareness. He wanted to create a people who knew that their story matters, that their aesthetics don't need validation, that their presence is political. And Zendaya understood that early on. That's why every decision she makes has weight. Every silence has intention. Every speech is a message to those who think we've already won. Have you ever wondered why so many people still get bothered when a black woman talks about her place? Because there's a deep fear that she'll realize the power she has. Zendaya realized it, and she didn't run away from it. And that's why Martin Luther King would say that she's doing exactly what the fight requires, being honest, being firm, being free. And you, what have you done with your freedom? Do you use it to denounce or to protect yourself? Do you use it to open doors or to hide behind them? Dr. King would say that those who remain silent in the face of injustice also participate in it. And comfortable silence is one of the most cowardly forms of racism. Zendaya has been called many things, but what she has been most, and still is necessary. Necessary because she reminds us of what's at stake. She reminds us that racism doesn't disappear with applause. It's past time for you to stop looking at this from the outside. Racism isn't a distant news story. It's not a social media debate. It's not a documentary topic. It's what runs through the skin of many people every day. It's what decides who has a chance and who will be discarded before even trying. And it's no use pretending you don't see it. Because every time someone like Zendaya is called not black enough, something breaks. Not in her, in you, in us. You need to start asking yourself seriously, why is it so easy to doubt the pain of those who live with racism? Why is it so automatic to distrust the word of a black woman? Why does discomfort arise when she doesn't lower her head? You know, deep down, you know. It's because accepting her truth requires you to move, for you to review, for you to stop hiding behind excuses and start realizing that omission is also a choice. Silence also builds the bars. Zendaya didn't have to die to become a martyr. She's alive, she's talking, she's acting. And even so, there are people who prefer to diminish her, who say it's an exaggeration, that it's victimhood, that it's just another celebrity trying to get attention. Have you ever stopped to think about what it's like to have to justify your own existence? To have to explain, repeat, insist, just to be treated with the minimum of respect? Could you handle that? Martin Luther King never asked for kindness. He demanded justice. He didn't climb onto the pulpit to make a pretty speech. He tore his soul apart in public squares to say, enough is enough. And now he would say to you, without mincing words, the world hasn't changed just because you call yourself anti-racist. The world changes when your posture changes. When you stop waiting for others to do it. When you start to confront, even if it hurts. And it's no use just feeling guilty. Guilt doesn't transform. Guilt paralyzes. What moves is responsibility. What moves is courage. And if you're not willing to lose your comfort, then maybe you've never been on the right side. It's no use applauding when a black woman breaks a barrier if you remain silent when she's humiliated, or when you're the one reinforcing the humiliation. You need to understand that racism isn't just when someone shouts. It's also when you prefer the lighter one. It's when you call standard what only represents you. It's when you say you're not racist, but you live surrounded by white people and you think that's normal. It's when you call yourself neutral, but you're bothered by those who take a stand. It's when you demand that the black person be calm, educated, cordial, even after being hurt. You perceive the injustice, but you choose to ignore it, because it suits you. And then you see Zendaya being diminished for wearing her natural hair, for wanting a dignified character, for talking about privileges, and you still want to know if it was racism? If you need to be sure, it's because perhaps you don't have the courage to admit that you participate in it, even in silence, even from afar. Because whoever is silent allows. And Martin Luther King never called that neutrality. He called it complicity. Can you look in the mirror and honestly say you've done everything you can? Have you used your voice? Have you corrected those who repeat jokes disguised as opinions? Or do you only speak up when it costs you nothing? Have you ever defended a black person in a racist situation? Have you ever stopped an injustice? Have you ever offered support without judgment? Or do you only show up when the discussion is easy, when the audience is safe, when your image won't be tarnished? You need to decide, because you can't pretend it's not your problem anymore. You can't hide behind the word deconstruction. This isn't about deconstructing, it's about rebuilding. It's about looking at the pain of others with the seriousness it deserves. It's about stopping questioning the truth of those who have never had the right to lie, because black people have never had that privilege. Zendaya isn't an exception. She's just one of the few who managed to scream and be heard, but there are thousands who scream and you don't listen, because you choose not to listen, because she's not your sister, she's not your friend, she's not you, but she should be. Because while you think it's not your problem, someone is being silenced, expelled, erased, and you let it happen. You let it happen when you share but don't confront, when you comment but don't commit, when you understand but don't change, when you praise but don't question the system. You need to do more than feel. You need to act, you need to take a stand, even if it hurts, even if you lose, even if it's uncomfortable. And if you felt something up until now, if some word resonated with you, then don't ignore it. Don't let it pass. Don't close that wound again. It needs to be stirred up. It needs to be exposed. Because that's the only way it heals. With truth. With discomfort. With action. Now answer me honestly. Are you going to continue as you are? Are you going to keep thinking it has nothing to do with you? Are you going to close your eyes again? Or are you going to do what needs to be done? Because the choice is yours, but the consequence belongs to everyone. Ongs. And it's no use waiting for the next case of racism to explode in the media to feign indignation. Racism doesn't take vacations. It's acting now. And if you're not against it, you're standing beside it. So tell me, does this make sense to you so far? If it does, share it with those who need to hear it. If you've been through something like this, speak up. If you haven't, listen. And if it hurt, then maybe it's time to stop running away. Because the silence that protects also kills, and the time to change is now.